Good day, folks.
Good morning.
Hey, hello.
Hey, Trisha. Guess still qualifies as morning for you. It'd be cool if people's, like, there was like a visual map of where people are on the world, just kind of like a globe with just an approximation.
Just follow the sun.
Yeah, like, or like, yeah, like a sun and moon kind of icon in a way, almost like, you know, what you see over tide charts and stuff. Just like, okay, your response is a little slow because it's 2 in the morning. Although hopefully we've mitigated some of that. And 7's early, but nothing that a coffee can't do. I see Shiwei connecting. There he goes. Speaking of a globe where somebody's on the opposite side of it. Good day, Shiwei.
Yeah, hi, Steve.
Welcome. Hopefully this is a little more tolerable for you than, well, I don't know. The evenings, our evenings and your mornings are probably pretty good for you as well.
It's still late, but it's not Friday night.
Yeah. As long as it's not Friday night, it's okay.
Yeah, that's what I put a note on the doodle for the OCI one. It's to make sure that we think about that if we start doing Friday meetings, because that'll be Friday night for others. But anyway, we'll give a couple more minutes for folks to trickle in here.
While we're waiting, I caught up on the distribution recording. Steve, you're going off on a boat ride?
It looks like it. As with many of these expeditions, it's a daily event, so we'll that's the plan. We'll see.
Have fun.
Sailing a tall wooden ship assembled by hand through Canada into Alaska. We'll see how far Alaska I go, but it definitely is an adventure I couldn't pass up.
Yeah, sounds like a lot of fun.
All right, we got 2 more minutes. Let's see here. I'm just looking through to see how we got on the populated docs. Great. Cool. I'm trying to see if we have quorum here. I know Ian won't be able to make it. Milind, do we have folks, your team represented with Pritesh?
Yeah, me and Pritesh are here.
Okay. And Tasia said she couldn't make it. Marina. Okay. All right, great. Well, let's get the party started. Dan, you've got the first item. With the visual, let's get the energy.
You said it, I had to do it.
Yeah, Rita and I want to chat about this one a little bit. The outstanding tough design goal PRs that have been sitting around for a little bit. Marina, what did you want to do with these? Just kind of go over them one more time.
So yeah, I thought this might be just a good time to bring these back up now that we have a lot more of the goals and that kind of thing kind of solved and worked on, and just think again about what are the things we still need to talk about here and work on, and you know, just kind of revisit where we stand here, because then I'm happy to help, you know, basically how can we move this process forward, and as far as getting the tough design working. So I pasted in the agenda, that's the I think that was an old PR I'd opened, looking at how the tough design aligns with the specific goals of the Notary project as laid out. And I think that the ones that Tough really resolves that a lot of the other pieces of the design don't involve things like the rollback protection and especially rollback protection, like a cross registry rollback protection, as well as things like delegation key management and all of that. So we can focus on any of those different aspects, but I thought this might be a good time to revisit this. Any particular questions, or I can just go into it?
So how we looked at the PR. I think this is a pretty early one before I kind of actively started attending the meetings. I'll spend time on this, but I have some general high level thoughts around Tufts philosophy and some of the places where, especially in the cross registry use cases and where publishers and consumers are disconnected. I feel there are gaps in how Tough may work. It's not clear how Tough may work in those scenarios.
Yeah, I think I have another design doc somewhere where I looked into this issue a bit. So the idea basically is that you can have a Tough root at any level. And the idea is that you get rollback protection across whatever you put into that Tough root. And so you get some security advantages for having that be bigger, but there's also the option to have it be smaller for different particular cases. And then you can have the individual targets metadata files, which are kind of like the signature on the individual artifact. They're slightly different, but they're basically that. And those particular pieces can move between registries or between roots, sorry. And the different roots are then responsible for things like timestamp, snapshot, or some version of timestamp snapshot, and basically responsible for timeliness and consistency and those pieces, whereas the individual kind of artifact signatures can be moved without affecting that piece. I think that's the general idea. I'll find that other document I wrote about that, which goes into a little bit more detail.
And I'm trying to understand the general concern, because even with some of the other proposals we've looked at, they don't work when you're offline. So it's the same challenge. We have to solve it just different directions on this, whether or not you have to maintain a mirror that's constantly updated, or whether or not you have to have access to some kind of verification, some kind of revocation authority. One way or another, you need some kind of access.
Oh, interesting. Are you worried about the offline case, Brandon?
I think that was the question we were just proposing right there, of how does Tough handle the offline case? And I'm just saying it feels like it's the same no matter what we talk about. We got the same challenges.
I think it
Yes.
kind of boils into the two major categories of things, and there'll be some overlap, but there's the public registries that the assumption is that their content is copied out of them to other locations, including what Brandon's kind of calling offline. We just, we generalize as air gapped. It's if it's offline, what does offline mean? If it's dead, it doesn't do anything. So it's like kind of like just as a silly thing, but it's this is back to, it's not submarines and oil platforms. It's every customer wants their environment to be completely isolated, have no public access to any IP outside of what they've targeted. So we have to be able to move I keep on saying move. We have to be able to copy the content, the segments of the content they want into their environment, and give them the ability to do validations within that environment. The thought process is the public registries need revocation, critically, because every software vendor and redistributor will want to provide that capability, so that somebody that's bringing things off, you got me saying it, into air-gapped environments has a way to know that content is no longer valid. Once they're in their environments, customers know the deployments that they manage, and the revocation series to build that infrastructure to manage that has not been a priority for them. Some will, so we'll make sure it's possible, but many have said we know where deployments are. We're not worried about our content being redistributed outside of our environment. They want that they have that tight control. So there's those two categories that we're trying to account for. But the content has to be able to copy easily in segments and be efficient. And a main goal here we're trying to enable is the registry is no more than a dumb storage bucket that has increasingly limited more knowledge. So we're trying to avoid things that where it has to reprocess anything as content moves into a registry, rather than maybe indexing. So
Yeah, I
that's
think that
kind of
makes sense. And I think that the one of the things I've been thinking a lot about this kind of snapshot timestamp piece of the tough process, and I think that's the only piece that would need to be recomputed, is basically that it's more important for these kind of public registries, the places where you're not actually managing your own content, and to like where you need to ensure things like consistency, timeliness, in those properties. And basically, and I think that in some cases you'll want to do that at the consumer registry. And I think that you gain some security properties, but I think there's also an option to maybe just say this particular list of images right now are the ones that you should use. And whether or not this is timely and consistent is, out of scope for our particular deployment. And I think that there are disadvantages there. For example, rollback is a big disadvantage, but I could understand why for smaller situations that might work, which is part of why having it be a separate piece is kind of nice.
I know we've had discussions before about how much this should be pushed to the client, where the client is doing its verification and running through various validation checks. And so the client may say, when I'm pulling from this mirror, I don't care if it's stale, go ahead and keep using it anyway. And so that might be a client side decision that someone decides to make.
They need the information to know, but you can't force them to upgrade or move, because that could actually be worse than the implied vulnerability itself.
Yeah, exactly.
So
I think that the policy on the client side, I think, is an important piece that maybe, it's an important piece to consider, but I don't think it's something that we need to tell them how to do. I just think they should have full information about the fact that, the person who signed this no longer thinks it's good, but if you still want to use it, do what you want. That's not our job. It's our job just to make sure that they know that this doesn't have a current signature, and then whatever they want to do with that is fine.
Yeah, and just because it doesn't have a current signature doesn't mean that the original source doesn't trust it. It just means that you might have a stale mirror. You might have been disconnected for a long time and not have updated your mirror.
Yeah. So sorry, just to go back to the original subject, I guess what does it take to resolve this PR? Is it ready to be merged, or are there some open issues that need to be solved based on discussions here?
So at least speaking for myself, I haven't reviewed it. I can make a pass over it. I don't think we'll spend too much time in this hour to go into in depth, but at a high level, the concerns that I have or want to dig in more in depth are the areas, some of which we touched upon, are the notion of latest. Many consumers don't have the notion of always running the latest. There may be multiple versions of a given software that are considered valid. So older versions need not be marked as invalid. Complete hierarchy. So for example, in Notary, you have root.json having a complete PKI hierarchy. When you get into larger PKIs like organizational with hundreds of employees and each user or machine having a key, wherever you have a large hierarchy, you work with partial PKI hierarchies and establish trust using partial. So that is one area. That is another area. The other is around revocation. I know TUF supports, I think it's called implicit revocation or rotation of keys. If that is supported through multiple root keys or some mechanism to make it stronger, basically the way I understand root key rotation, you use a new root key to rotate the older one. Want to make sure that it addresses the scenario where it uses an old root key to sign the new root key. Needs to address the scenario where if old root key is compromised, it doesn't allow somebody to take control of the hierarchy. And I think it can be done via multiple root keys. I think it just wasn't supported in Notary at that point.
Yeah, I think that at least the root key piece, I know that Tough is really careful about that and having, first of all, thresholds of root keys that are stored offline. So that even if one root key is compromised, you can really easily recover from that. And also just by having that hierarchy so that the offline root keys can be used less often and stay more secure. And then you can use those to revoke, anything down the tree of delegations. So that's actually definitely one thing that I think the Tough designers spend a lot of time on is looking at making sure revocation is going to be really easy and straightforward.
Yeah, we can. I think each of these areas needs some more discussion. There's a few more. The other is where the metadata, trust stored metadata will be stored. In our previous discussions, we didn't want the registry to store some of this data. Like, will it be configured and distributed through out of band? That is another area to be discussed. Next is how root.json is scoped in terms of correspondence to either per repository or per customer. I think there are cases where customers own a bunch of repositories, and for them having to manage a root or a hierarchy per repository, it's difficult to manage multiple hierarchies. Is there a way to have that hierarchy apply to multiple registries?
Yeah, that was one of the biggest differences we were looking at for Tough's use in Notary v2 versus v1. That there were a lot of issues actually with having the root be at the repository level, because you also get the whole issue with trust on first use being like the first use being every use, because if you're only downloading from a repository one time, whereas by putting that root at a higher level, either at the registry level or depending on the use case at like a subset of the registry or even a superset of the registry, you can then scope that differently. And first of all, make it easier to manage things like the timestamp and snapshot. And second of all, really make the key management easier for individual developers, because you have those root keys, which really do need to be secure, managed by someone at the higher level. And then you can use those then to delegate down to individual developers working on particular repositories.
Yeah.
So I think that the proposal is really to have a lot more flexibility in where those roots are based, depending on particular use cases, with the idea being to have more stuff within a root, especially if one person has a lot of repositories. It obviously makes sense, right, to put those together.
Yeah.
It looks like Steve has a question too. Oh, either one of you.
I have a last point. Then the last one is around the timestamping service and timestamp. So that's an additional function that needs to be implemented by somebody. And I think currently registry operators, I think Steve can also provide feedback there, may not have that function, as they are managing more of a static repository service. And related to that is, if the timestamp key and snapshot key, I think in many examples, timestamp key and snapshot key is managed by the server. In that model, I don't understand how a compromise of a targets provides you additional protection. If timestamp and snapshot is auto managed by a service where anything pushed is automatically timestamped and snapshotted, updates to snapshot, then a compromise of targets, somebody compromises a target, pushes it, it is automatically timestamped and snapshots is updated. I think that I still have questions around the model, but like each of these are areas we can dig into.
Yeah, so this sounds like a great list, and I'd be happy to, if we like maybe write it out and we can discuss it either on GitHub or maybe in a meeting, because I definitely have responses to various things. I don't know where the best format for that would be.
Yeah, I agree. I think Milind and others here have a lot of very good technical questions that I think absolutely needs to be resolved. No question about it. I guess my larger question here is about the process. This PR has been open since March. We should figure out a good process for figuring out either we say that the design is not good enough, you need to close it and come back with a new one, or at least provide a concrete timeline for like resolving questions like this. Otherwise, I'm kind of concerned about PRs just staying open forever.
I think so. This kind of comes to a couple of things. One of the pieces that we need to account for is the concept that key management is decoupled from the registry persistence. When I have things signed on my laptop, where it's located on disk has no relation to what key was used. And that's the same model that we're trying to do here with registries. And that's a fundamental difference from Notary V1. This is the whole, where the content is has nothing to do with what entity signed it and how even revocation necessarily would be managed. So, take a look, if I look at the way Microsoft stuff is shipped on MCR or even other stuff is shipped on Docker Hub is probably a little bit different because orgs tend to be grouped in some way. But if you look at the content across MCR or NVIDIA or Red Hat or Oracle or the other software registries, because there's three categories. There's software registries, there's redistributors like Docker Hub, ECR, and then there's the private registries that customers have themselves. The model that the content can be any location is really important, and then I can get that decoupling. But if you look at, we have lots of product teams at Microsoft. We're working out how we're going to allocate the keys. Like, is the .NET team use the same keys as the ML team that use the same as the Windows team? They'll obviously all be signed by Microsoft with a root key, but those, .NET has several repos that they work in. There's actually a hierarchy to some extent to those as well. So I really just want to make sure that as we're looking at the design options, and this has been one of the fundamental differences, is location of where the content is has nothing to do with the hierarchy of the keys. So anything to do with the repo is.
I think I very much agree, and I think that's going to be one of the definitely one of the things that we're going to need to work on is a different way to do those delegations such that it's more to those teams, like you were saying. I think one of the big advantages of the tough style delegations is, well, it's two things. It's the ability to not share keys by delegating to multiple different parties who each do a different thing. Like, every time you pass a key from one computer to another, you're increasing the risk of compromise just by the nature of computers. But if you're able to just delegate to a different computer for each team, or even better for each developer, you can then decrease the risk of each key compromise and really make it easier to resolve that. And the other big advantage is that you don't universally trust a key for every single image that you trust. You trust, the Azure key for Azure. You trust the Windows key for Windows, for, using the Microsoft example, or, whatever it may be. And so that if, heaven forbid something does go wrong with the Windows key, only Windows is compromised, not Azure. And you couldn't use that key for anything outside the scope of what it's trusted for. Now, I mean, Windows is probably not a great example of this, but if, say, it was more of a one-person team project where, that key is compromised because maybe they don't have as many resources, then you don't risk your entire infrastructure being compromised because of this one key being compromised, which is the kind of thing you see in these attacks, like the, what is it called? I always forget, like it's, various versions of like typo-squatting and other kinds of attacks where it's because you universally trust the entire repository or the registry or whatever you want to call it to sign everything, which is, it just makes the scope of an attack a lot bigger.
No, totally agree. So just from a process perspective, so we can get to the other items in the agenda, I think this is why we lit up discussions, because we wound up discussing things in a PR format where it's great because you can do the feedback and commenting, so there's an interactive conversation, but the content itself isn't necessarily something we would put into the spec in the way it's written. It's more of like, hey, here's some conversations. This is kind of goes back to the design options, for instance, one of the first PRs that were put in. It's a great discussion. It doesn't form as a great PR for what we're trying to merge into main at this point. So I think that would be my recommendation, is let's move that to a discussion and work through those things as they equate back to our goals of content movement or content copying across registries. Yeah, Brandon.
So to Trashank's point there, then if we're going to say this is something that we don't want to merge in, we should go ahead and put that in the PR and say, we're rejecting this because of X, and give that clear direction instead of leaving it hanging out there.
That's
Right,
fair.
exactly. My concern is that it's been 4 months. It took us this long to get to this point to say we should close this, which is fine. Things happen. I understand. I think going forward, we need to make better use of people like Marina's time now. So if we're going to be concrete about these are some non-negotiable technical requirements, and we need solid answers before we would agree to merge any substantial PR, we should be very clear about the process. Right now, the process is not clear at all.
Yeah,
No, it's
and
fair
so-
feedback. We've talked about this a couple of times, and we've been reluctant to rudely just close PRs. This is why we open discussions. I've asked for that design options one, for instance, to be moved to a discussion so that we lose it. So I don't want to, and I don't want to purposely pick on Brandon here for a second, like reject or whatever the rude, and I'm air quoting for those that aren't watching, wording, because it's not reject. This is just not the right forum for have the discussion. Let's, put it in this, put a link, create the discussion. Let's start entering it there. Put a link to the discussion in that PR, copy and paste the content over if that makes sense. And then we can close that PR and then have the discussion to flow out to the issues that can then map back to the PRs that we're trying to get to. So I absolutely want your feedback. Like, this is the thing that we've said in public and in private with folks from Tough as a whole, is that we really value all of the expertise that you have put and done research and done implementations and done papers on. We're trying to take that and leverage it to content that moves copies across public to private registries at massive scale. So we absolutely want your input.
So yeah, I think that if it's not too much to ask, I did link to my general tough design document, and if folks have time, maybe give that a read and then post. I think all these concerns that were mentioned today are great things to talk about, and I'd love to find a forum for us to do so. I think in text form might be just a little more efficient, but we can also do it in these meetings if that's easier for folks. But definitely, I think that design covers a lot of what I understood from the concerns in our previous discussions, and I'm sure that there was more, but I just want to make sure that we kind of at least start from the progress that's already been made. So yeah,
That's right.
so that's where that is.
So what is the consensus exactly that we're, so what is the, let's make sure we're all on the same page. So Steve, are you saying let's close this PR because it's too big maybe to discuss all of these issues? And you're proposing we move each of these concerns brought up by people here, a specific discussion for each, and then recommend that Marina send a PR to address each discussion? How should she move forward is the question.
No, that's fair. Sorry, I thought it was we're trying to not start with the end result. We're trying to go through the requirements of content copying across public to private in those scenarios. Those are the high level requirements of Notary V2. The content that's in that PR starts with I don't want to say a different design philosophy. It starts with some other content. The content is valuable. We have to figure out how to map it to the requirements of how we're solving Notary V2's goals. The discussions, the conversation points that are in there, we want to capture. Let's open a discussion item that we will capture that conversation so we can continue that conversation. Put a link to that discussion item in the PR, and let's close that PR, because as written, it's a discussion format. It's not necessarily meant for be a PR into the Notary V2 at this point.
And
So we're not losing it, we're capturing it. And then as that discussion comes to conclusions, those outcomes should go into the content that we've been merging into the repos.
So let me throw out a third option, which is, what if we merge this, but in a different branch? And that way we can iterate on the branch. We're not modifying whatever is put on the main branch out there, but we just say this is the tough theory of how they might want to try to do things on that side, and that way
this is
we're able to iterate.
It's actually it's a PR to the tough prototype branch, which is exactly that. There's a whole actually design in that branch that this is iterating on. So
yeah, because my opinion is if we've got it in a different branch, we're making new files over there, we can iterate and discuss and make progress over there without impacting the rest of the spec. And I feel like that would be a good use of our time to just iterate that way.
I have a concern there, though, that there hasn't been a lot of engagement with the tough design. So if we keep doing it in a separate branch, are people just going to ignore it?
Yeah, and to Joshua's point, it's not really just to the a tough branch. We've had this challenge, and this was the feedback a couple months ago with the prototype twos and branches, is that it was just too far out of sight. And so my original intent was, let's iterate and innovate, incubate in a branch, and then as we continue to feel more confident, then we move it into main. And the feedback was, let's invert that. Actually, put stuff in main that we feel is going towards that particular goal of that project, and then it'll break and change as we're iterating, and then we release something out of main, and that's what is, and that's kind of the normal process. So that's what we've shifted to. So for instance, I think Shiwei actually did create a prototype 3 in something, and we're actually going to move things into main and iterate from there. That's the high level goal. The specific to a tough implementation, for lack of a better definition, this is the part that what Justin was talking about, is as we get the requirements kind of landed, and as we start shifting into design, which we're really close here, right? That's part of why I really want to cap this and get to the rest of the docs that Melinda has there. We'll have more repos under the Notary project to capture various components of it. So rather than there being a tough branch alongside some other prototype end branch, there'll be something to do with Tufts component for revocation as a repo that'll be, I'm not using the right words, module, whatever we want to think about it as we get closer to design. This way it has the right focus, it has the right maintainers, and the overall project can be.
Yeah, we've had this tough branch on the repository for the past 6 months or so, and I have a whole design in there, and I haven't gotten any feedback on it, which makes me think that nobody is seeing it where it is right now. So it'd be great to have that in a place where we could get that feedback so we can move this conversation forward. Because I know that there are still concerns, but I also know that some of these concerns are things that I have written in that design, in that branch that's merged into the repository. So I just want to make sure that we're not duplicating effort, basically, by making sure that this is all visible.
Agreed. That's why I want to get them out of branches and have discussion. But I do want to get back to what are the requirements? What are the things, like this is what we've been trying to capture in those other PRs that Milind Shiwei, sorry, I'm flipping over to, and Pritesh have talked about. So
I think just want to address another dynamic. Part of it is also, I think some of us are focused on, we want to do this iteratively and have the initial building blocks of so we are focusing more on signature format, what the basic validation looks, and trying to address the initial set of requirements. I think as we go through the discussion around tough, basically each of the areas, how it aligns with the existing set of requirements and how we can address it, I think we can make progress. I think probably, at least from my side, we have been spending more time on the signature format and the initial iteration that we want to release. Can we?
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to move on to the next topic. If you wanted to add anything to Sean.
Yeah, no. I would like us to move on too. I'm just worried that we don't have good consensus yet. I mean, for example, I agree with Brandon that a branch is actually more visible than this. Either way, it has the rabbit hole of the pitfall of being ignored. Unfortunately, you can easily ignore discussions. You can easily ignore branches. I just want to make sure Marina goes in a good direction here. Marina, do you have any thoughts about this? What you would like to do next, and what you'd
Yeah,
like
I
to see
mean,
from
I
the
think that I've previously proposed that we make the main branch just like a table of contents to the different implementation ideas, so that when people first see it, they see what the options are and where the different progress is going, rather than seeing a particular prototype that we're going to later iterate on and replace, just so people can see what's going on in the different branches, including the tough design.
Okay,
Can
so
we-
the
can we agree on
proposal
this?
is that we will, let's get some of the conversations in a discussion. I don't disagree with that. And then as we, because we're also jumping a little bit to the design, we're still trying to make sure we're capturing the component requirements. And that's why, again, I really want to move to the other items in the list. So, because that's exactly what we're saying we need to get through to get to these conversations.
Well, I think I actually disagree there. I think that we don't fully know what the requirements are until we know what the designs we're trying to support are. And I think that we need to make sure that if we're doing this model where we have these different kind of modules that can plug into an interface, we need to make sure that we know what the modules are, so we know what the interface needs to support. It's not really it's kind of a both and, in my opinion.
Are we saying we do design before we finish requirements?
No, I'm saying, but we're not talking about
We have
requirements
been.
anymore. We're talking about design. We're talking about what the envelope should look like, what these other pieces should look like, which means we need to know what's going into them.
I feel like we have been doing design. We talk about DISI and whether it needs to be a JWT or any of the other formats. We've been going down the design process already.
But they're more componentized, centered around our requirements to be able to have the content movement, content copying that we've been referring to. So I feel we're getting stuck on this one, and we've kind of captured what we wanted to do as next steps. And I want to make sure we get to the other ones, because it has, you know, Marina's and Trishank's input. I mean, one of the conversations is how do we do better alignment with DISI and the payload format to make sure we're meeting the requirements of Notary v2 and aligning with some of the other efforts that are going on.
I agree, for the interest of time and unblocking other issues, we should move on. But one thing we absolutely need to resolve is having a good process for moving things forward. Because right now it's not clear at all. So yeah, we'll probably open a few discussions and things like that. But I think for the next agenda, we should allocate some serious time to establishing, you know, formal, rigorized processes. Like, for example, nothing will take more than 2 weeks to review and finish, right? Or either that or we close it.
Okay. All right, Milind, requirements updates. Okay, perfect title.
Yeah, give me just a second. I'll share my screen. Sorry, I'm having trouble figuring out where my window is. Okay, I think it is this one. This shouldn't take much time. Wanted to cover some updates to the requirements in this doc and gather quick feedback on if there are any concerns. So one was we talked last time about how multiple signatures will be represented. I think we reached consensus that each envelope will contain only one signature. So updated the requirement here. And then the kind of associated one is how multiple signatures will be represented. I think there are still a few options here that we could discuss. I put one option here, which is every new signature is a separate signature manifest and associated signature envelope blob. So let me know if there are any feedback or concerns with these. We'll use this to drive the prototype for those formats which we're considering. Okay, and then the next one is these two, which is TSA and X509 certificate. So if the signature is timestamped by a TSA, it must be stored in an unsigned signature metadata. That is one. And if the signature was produced by a X509 certificate, then the signature must contain the complete certificate chain as an unsigned attribute. So there are two parts to this. One is complete certificate chain, and the second is unsigned attribute. You have multiple options to store the certificate. Like in some formats, like JWS, you have X5U, which is the URL to a certificate, or you can just contain the leaf certificate and use there's an AIA authority. I forget the authority information. There are URLs in certificate that point to the issuing certificate. But we feel, given that we want to make the verification make as little remote calls as possible, having the complete certificate chain available during verification time makes it less brittle, and you have less cases where validation may fail just because you are not able to retrieve the other certificates in the chain, or you are in a constrained environment and you just don't have access. So that's related to the certificate chain. And the unsigned attribute is because the chain is validated against your trust store. So the signature validation is basically two steps: verifying the payload signature itself and verifying that the certificate chain chains to one of your trust anchors in your trust store. All right, okay. That was it. The next update is by Pritesh. That's mainly around follow-up from last time, where we said we'll capture some examples of what the payload looks like in different formats.
Are we at a point where we can start getting this into PRs?
Yeah, we can. I think it is in a state where we have broader agreement to push this in a CR, or in a PR.
Yes, I will do that.
Thanks, Shiva.
Pritesh, do you want to take over for the next item?
Sure, yeah. So as discussed in last meeting, we have crafted the examples of payload and signature envelopes using JWS and DC. So we can go through them and then get a feedback on them. And let me share the screen.
So this is the hack doc that we did from last meeting, where we said, let's capture what the formats would look like based on the requirements for movement and how we could integrate with the existing formats so that we can start doing the next round of prototypes.
Yeah, that is correct.
To be fair, it's a good question to figure out how to call prototypes, or every project seems to have their own acronym for things, but basically what is the next thing we would check into main instead of a branch that shows the continued progress on this. And until there's a release, it is the place where the iteration happens. Pritesh, are you going to lead this one?
Yep, I'm trying to share screen, but Zoom is
Oh,
not
okay.
Screen. I'll share my screen. Give me just a moment. Can everyone see my screen? All right. Pritesh, you can drive.
So basically the target image is the image which we want to sign. The notary to manifest the manifest. Scroll down. This is the manifest for which it's the same as what we want to sign again. The subject manifest the part where we want to sign. Then the bottom, just scroll down. Then there are examples using the JWS JSON. You need to refresh. Yeah. Then we have crafted an example of how the payload and the signature will look like using the JWS JSON. In JWS JSON, basically the idea is you have two placeholders for content. One is like header and the claims, or called payload. So in this, the idea was like we will define a top level node called Notary V2, which will contain two sub level nodes: subject manifest, which is which relates to the image, which contain the image which we want to sign and its article and its content. Then there's a second attribute called signed attributes, which will contain the metadata related to the signature. In signed attributes, we have defined two sub-level nodes. One is reserved and one is custom. Reserved will be used only for Notary V2 use cases such as article revocation URL, identity, or any other information which we want to add into the signature. The custom node can be used by customers to add any custom data. For example, if a builder's the customers, like the user can add the build number for the container image, or they can in the pipeline they can add a signature saying that okay, the image was signed and all that information. We have also defined IAT and EXP, which are basically the JWS claims. IAT says that when the image was signed, and EXP says the expiration time. This is expiration time which identifies till what time the signed image would be valid. We had to define IAT and EXP as a top level attribute instead of inside the signature attribute reserved ones, to leverage the functionalities provided by JWS libraries for claims. Yeah, can you scroll down? Then the second part is the protected headers. In JWS, the protected headers are basically the headers which will be signed along with the payload. I think JWS algorithm is a compulsory part. We had to define the algorithm node here, which will follow the JWS standards of the algorithm names. Then we have defined the content type. The idea behind the content type was to support the versioning of the signature format if we have to support that, and uniquely identify the Notary V2 signatures. Yeah. And the third node is a critical one, which just marks the content type as the critical. Algorithm is by default a critical node as per the JWS design. The third section is the signature envelope, which describe how the signature payload will look like, which is basically the payload is like, it will have like 4 top level elements. The first one is payload, which will contain just the base64 URL encoded string of the payload. Second is the protected headers, which just contain the base64 URL encoding of protected headers. Then we will have a header. The header section is basically an unprotected collection of key value pairs. In header section, we have incorporated the timestamp, key ID, and X5C certificate chain. So timestamp would be an optional field. Same goes for key ID and X5C. But if the image was signed or generated using the certificate, then the user has to include the X5C field. X5C is basically base64. It's a collection of base64 and encoded DER certificates, which will chain up to the root. Yeah, and then the signature is calculated using concatenating the payload, protected headers, and then generating the base64, then just signing them and generating then encoding them again using base64 URL encoding. So that's about JWS. And then we can move to extended DC version. In extended DC version, the payload is similar to that as that of JWS, except that we have just modified it a little bit to make it compact here. Subject manifest again targets the image which you want to sign. They are signed attributes, which is same as that of JWS payload. In signature envelope, we again have like two fields, like in signature envelope signature section node, we have again added key ID and X5C and timestamp field. It's worth noting that as of now, DigiCurrent doesn't support the certificate chain and the timestamp field. And then we have two open questions at the bottom. The first one is, so how do you want to go now? Do we want to discuss the format, then we can go through open questions, or we want to start with the open questions?
I think originally I would have preferred like how we do the other documents. Everybody spend some time, put comments. That allows folks to, like us, to capture the detailed comments and then go through the comments and specifically focus on the open questions. But I'm open to suggestions. We just have around 8 minutes or so left. Or we can cover this in detail last time and just talk about the open questions. I also want to highlight that some of the examples are illustrative, like for example, ARL and identity. We haven't settled down on these. These are other discussions that we need to define the semantics and agree upon the mechanisms. So those are open areas. These are illustrative. But if folks don't have any high level questions, and I mean, we have been talking about these two formats for some time. If there are any high level questions, we can cover it in next couple of minutes, and we could focus on the open questions, and we can capture feedback offline, or we can reserve time next week to capture feedback. I think that works, given that we have limited time left. Is that okay?
Sounds good to me.
Okay, are there any high level questions based on what Pritesh described?
I think the biggest one would be, can we get this into the GitHub with the other stuff, just so that it's clear where this all fits together and avoid any duplication there?
Yeah, I think each of these, I think the thought process was we can do quick iterations over, because some of this is collaborative work. I'll update some sections, or Pritesh will update, or she will contribute. So it's easier to do it in HackDoc, review, get some consensus. Doesn't mean everything is ironed out, and then submit it as a PR. We address kind of the final set of things, do a detailed review, and then push it in. It's just easier for collaboration instead of when multiple people are working on things, to use PRs, because we'll be updating different people will be updating the PRs.
Okay, fair enough. So yeah,
The risk is it's
I'll find
just
this
not
one.
visible.
I
Yeah,
did create, for the visibility issue, I did create issues under Notary Project that track each of these hack docs, so we're not losing them. to Melin's point, there's some of these really do help for quick iteration, where it's not just people providing feedback and then the person that owns the PR has to make the edits. But the others, I think we've gotten pretty far with the others that we can and should shift them to PRs. This one, I feel like we're getting close, but I know the other ones were definitely closer. Or I believe we're at the point for the others, so.
Yeah, this comes back to my question about processes. I think so. It's of course totally fine to use HackMD to iterate early and fast. I totally get it. But unfortunately, the rest of us are not privy to these HackMDs. We're not sure where they are created. We don't see them advance ahead of time, so we don't get to follow. We clearly need to establish processes that the whole group can follow. We need to agree on things like, okay, look, if we're going to do anything first, we're going to open it. We're going to open an issue and point HackMD to it, and all of us can take a look. Maybe even open separate things as discussions. But the point is, things are right now all over the place, and there's no clear processes to follow. It's one of my biggest issues right now. I think we need to solve this kind of meta issue first before we try to solve technical issues, because otherwise it's kind of harebrained, to be honest. Speaking of which,
Trish, that's not a fair representation. Marina's on our calls. We've been discussing these. There's no, it's not like there's something else going on. We've been discussing these in the calls. We discuss these in the Notary channel. Although we all have, the ones that have been working on these hack docs know where they are. They've been discussed in calls. The links have been pasted. They were getting to be too much to keep track myself. So that's why we did put issues to track each one. And the goal is there is an issue for every hack doc that we're iterating on. So there's a central place to look. And the goal is each of those, as the quick iterations are done, they do go into PRs or discussions. So I think.
Okay, great. My apologies if I misrepresented some things, but I think my larger point is still true. Processes are still not clear. Speaking of which, I wanted to raise the meta issue of when can we expect to discuss governance around this project, please? Do we know when Justin Carmack is going to show up?
I know Justin's working on it. I know those are good questions for Justin. I don't want to speak on behalf of Justin.
It seems to me that we need to have him around to establish these governance issues together before we get to resolve some of these technical issues. No?
Honestly, I feel like we're making the progress. We appreciate your engagement recently. You guys, Marina was here alone for a while. I appreciate, and Marina's doing an awesome job. So I think we had a really good call last week. There's a lot of great input, including this doc that we're looking at here, to try to converge on some ideas. So let's keep focused on that.
Okay, great. No. I listen. I agree. I want to make progress too. All I'm saying is I'd like to see some concrete timeline for governance. That's all.
I would too. Look, I really just Justin. It's not Justin owns that. He's working on getting that done. I don't want to try to speak for him. It's not just, and the problem isn't just Justin on governance. It's, we recognize his role in the company and how he gets pulled in multiple directions. I know he's working on getting other people to help, so it's not just bottlenecked on Justin. So that's, it's really all I can offer at this point, because otherwise I'm just starting to speak for Justin, and that's just not my place.
I think just to, if it's a discoverability and visibility issue, we started creating the tracking issues. But if we want to maintain a list of what are the active things being worked on, we can capture it in either the meeting as a top header in the meeting notes, or as another issue, if that is the concern. I think there are a couple of ways that I think there's some areas we can smoothen out if it feels the work is not discoverable or things are currently in progress.
Thanks, Millie.
So we are almost at time. Wanted to know if there's any high level feedback on what we covered, and we definitely need more time for everybody to look into this and provide any comments.
Yeah, I think this was some good discussion. I think we can definitely continue some of it offline in comments and stuff, and maybe make some iterations like that. That would be great.
And I think if there can be feedback here. One was use the how do we capture custom or customer annotations? I think there are two options to do it. So this subject manifest, this is a basic descriptor. We can use the annotations for any custom attributes, or we can pull it completely out and have another placeholder, a top level attribute, not a top level attribute, a map within this signed attributes and capture it. I just want to make sure that we don't misuse annotations in any way that is non-idiomatic of how OCI describes it. And I don't know enough about to have an opinion. I think some of you guys have.
I think it's kind of hard to misuse annotations.
I think what you mean is annotations is misused all the time.
So something, well, it's actually not annotations here, to be fair. So this did come up in, I don't know if Sajid's still here, he had a drop. When we were discussing this I'm trying to make sure I get the right context, because this is actually is in the envelope. When we were discussing this as part of the ACR implementation, we support customer managed keys, right? It's double encryption at rest. So all content in Azure, if somebody steals a disk, is encrypted with a key. Customers want to be able to provide their own key to double encrypt that content. So if somebody physically gets in and steals the disks, it's double encrypted with a customer's key as well. The interesting thing that's come up is what content which needs to be used for decision criteria, such as indexing and search criteria, can be unencrypted, so it could actually match an index hit. So I'm just triggering the conversation because we literally just discussed this yesterday as part of our own internal implementation. And I want to I hadn't thought about that before. So it's just something to think about. My guess is we're probably fine because this is part of the signature, but just think about those aspects.
Sure. Yeah, I think like probably in those cases, that annotation will go under here as part of the image manifest annotation itself, right? Like in this example. Is this the right example? Sorry, this example. You have the image manifest layers and then annotations for captured for this given image manifest. Again, we are pretty much we are going over time. We can discuss this in detail next time. And just highlighting, yeah, there's a second question. We can cover that in detail. On Busy, I think we have been having discussions. Trishank is also involved there on whether XYZ will be supported there or not. I think that's an ongoing conversation. But we also have the other thread about TSA, which has more consensus. So even at this point, we could go with either of these formats. I think Shive started working on a prototype for JWS, and we can talk about that next time if we have details, and we can, based on that, we can take a call on Dizzy 2 or do a Dizzy prototype next. I think those are topics for next week. All right. Thanks. That was all from my and Pritesh's side. If there's anything else from anybody before we close.
Nothing here. Till next week.
Thanks, folks.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.